All right, let's do this thing. We're finishing off 3.2, and we're talking about now leasing a house. Now, remember that when you lease a house, it can be an apartment, it could be a condo, it can be an actual house itself, it could be a townhouse, it could be any kind of property we're talking about that you are living in. And the whole idea is that the lease, the money that you pay, goes towards the landlord, the person who owns that property, and you're paying them simply for the privilege of living there. You're agreeing to keep the place clean and well taken care of, report any damage, but also not damage it yourself. Okay, other than, of course, normal wear and tear. Usually you have to pay a damage deposit. It could be anywhere from like half a month's rent to higher, really depending on what the landlord sets. And depending if you have pets living with you or not, they can also charge a pet deposit. Okay. Some of these are lumped together, sometimes they're not. Sometimes both of them exist, sometimes they don't. And sometimes you can't even bring in a pet, right? Because even though you have one, some places are pet free. So it's not that it's guaranteed that a pet would be allowed in the premises anyways. Now, those deposits exist so that if you don't keep things up to like a reasonable set of standards, that they get to keep that deposit to help kind of make sure that that upkeep that should have happened when you were there or maybe didn't get taken care of, or the damage that you potentially left behind gets covered with those costs. Now, when we lease a house, there are a house, and again, I'm going to say house, but I do really mean house, apartment, condo, senior's home, any of that. Whenever you're renting, we talk about leasing, there are some advantages. One advantage, and this is not always true, really depending on where you're staying, and right now rent has kind of gone up over the last few years. But sometimes, not always, sometimes the payments can be smaller. Now, when we take a look at this and when we're trying to use this as a stated advantage, we should really actually be comparing the monthly payment sizes or the bi-weekly or semi-monthly payment sizes. But a good chunk of time, that rent can be cheaper. Another advantage is that it's less responsibility, right? Oftentimes you are not in charge of repairs. So if something goes wrong, in your apartment, a pipe burst, there's a leak, there is a light that stops working, your landlord can be called and then they can take care of those repairs. And depending on where you're leasing from, you might not also be in charge of yard work, right? So if you're renting an apartment as opposed to, a house, that's something that wouldn't be in your scope. The biggest advantage is the fact that you do not have to make a massive down payment, right? There are some deposits that exist, but when we talk about a down payment on a house, that's a minimum of 5% of the purchase price of the home. And when we talk about purchase prices of the home, right, depending on what, house size you're trying to purchase, or even a condo size, let's say you find a condo for $200,000, 5% of that is still 10 grand. And some people do not have 10 grand laying around to be able to make that down payment with. So even if the mortgage payments or the lease payments would be similar, that down payment is a real advantage of avoiding when you're talking about leasing. Lastly, there's no long-term commitments. So say you want to live with your friend for a bit and you decide to rent, right? That helps you avoid the idea of figuring out how to legally split the ownership of the home if one of you decides to move out, right? It's also advantageous if you're planning to move to a new place and you're not 100% sure how much you'll love it there. Maybe you're going for university or school or even just for fun and you're not wanting to stay there long term, or you're not quite sure yet. That could be a real advantage. When we talk about disadvantages, typically you can't just choose to do renovations without permission from the landlord, and they have the ability to turn down those proposals. They also might not get back to you super quickly, Obviously, every landlord is different, but if you think of like every person, some people are like super on it. Some landlords and some people, and just in general, you ask them for something and it takes forever to hear back from them. All right, so there can be that annoying delay or rejection depending on kind of the scale of those renos you want to do. Another major disadvantage is that you don't build any equity, right? So if you are financing a home and you're making those mortgage payments, eventually you are making those payments to eventually own that property, that house, that condo, etc. But here you're just paying for the privilege of living there, so there's nothing that you own at the end of it. Another disadvantage is depending on where you move, it might not be something that you're allowed to bring pets into. So if you are a big pet fan, that can be a really big disadvantage. And then the other thing is that rent can change over time, right? If inflation happens and, that landlord is paying more for the upkeep, is paying, perhaps they have employees that go and help manage these things, and with the wages go up, then their costs are going to go up, which means they can choose to increase the rent. That could also be if something in the building needs to be renovated, whether you directly benefit from that renovation or not, then perhaps they're going to raise rent, and that's not something you can control. They will give you notice. They're supposed to give you notice so that you can make decisions of whether you want to stay there or whether you want to leave. But when we talk about mortgage payments, that mortgage payment is like pretty set. The only thing that can change is if you're in a variable interest rate, and that interest rate changes over time. Or even if you're locked in at an interest rate at the end of your term, depending what the new interest rate you negotiate is, then it can change a little bit. But it's kind of going to be locked in if you chose a locked in interest rate for that term period of time. Now, one day you might be in charge or might be thinking, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to rent. And we're going to talk through that process. So before you actually agree and sign the lease, things that you should do, find out what the rent includes. Some rent just includes you living there. That's it. Nothing else. Some rent might charge you extra for parking. And it might be like, oh, one parking space is included, but if you want a second one, it's not. Things like that. Utilities. So when we talk about like water, one of my friends, when they lived in an apartment, had water included. And my friends are like, sweet, we could take long, big soaking baths every single day. So we're not paying for the water. No problem. And then when they moved out, they're like, oh, wow, that's actually a lot of money that we spent on water. Okay. But utilities may or may not include lawn care, and so like shoveling and stuff. Typically an apartment would include that, but if you're talking about not an apartment, but like maybe a duplex or something like that, a house that you're renting, that's something that might be on you. And then internet. Even if it doesn't include internet, you should look into what internet providers can provide internet to that apartment, because sometimes there's only one provider to choose from because they're already wired into like most of the buildings there. So you might be kind of stuck with one provider, whether you like them or not. You should also make a budget, and that budget should include all of those costs. So the cost of the rent and the cost of all those utilities. Ages ago, I went apartment shopping with one of my friends. She was moving to the States for school, and there was one apartment that was much cheaper than the others. And, she was thinking, oh, maybe I'll go with this one. It's similar in terms of, how close it is to school and all of the, different benefits that came with that place. However, it did not include any of utilities or parking or internet or anything at all. And so once you started factoring in all of those costs, it actually was more cost effective to go with the slightly more expensive apartment because it included all of those values within it. Okay. Things to consider would also be like a roommate, if it's pet friendly, perhaps just the building safety and cleanliness, right? If obviously if you're living in an apartment, you have your own space. But if you notice that front door entering the apartment maybe doesn't seal properly, that can be a really big safety concern. And it might not be worthwhile living there if you're not going to feel safe, right? Cleanliness, same idea. If you're noticing like the hallways leading from one apartment to the next is like super grungy and like really gross, that might give you an indication about the landlord. If they're not taking care of just like the common spaces, how well are they going to take care of you and your particular apartment? You probably want to also figure out who you want to call for issues. Sometimes there's a maintenance person that lives in the building that can help you with those requests, and it can be really, really quick. But sometimes that person's off-site, and depending on your apartment, depending what you have access to, who knows? Maybe you do not have the shut-off water valve in your apartment, so if something springs a leak, now you're stuck and it's flowing out regardless of your abilities to turn it off. Consider accessibility, right? Is it perhaps like wheelchair friendly, or is there an elevator there so that if you're taking out groceries to your apartment every day, you don't have to go up 6 flights of stairs? Maybe if you have like older relatives that might come and visit you, maybe if there's a lot of steps, that can be really difficult for them. Then also look into your tenant rights. As someone who is leasing, there are certain rights that are associated with you and being a tenant. So look into those and make sure that none of those rights are being glossed over, and that you're still making sure that all of the things that you are asking within reason can still be taken care of. Oops. Okay. Once you lease, what you do next? Well, obviously pay your rent on time. If you do not pay rent on time, sometimes they'll give you a warning. And then eventually, if that's something that does not continue to happen, you're not paying your rent on time, that's something that can cause you to be evicted, right? They can choose to boot you out, okay? Pay your damaged and pet deposits if those exist. If you need to set up any utilities or TV or internet, make sure that you're doing that. You want to get renter's insurance. So if there's any damage to your property, kind of like house insurance exists. So if there's anything that happens to your house and your property within that house, then you can file an insurance claim, pay your deductible, and get either reimbursed for whatever damage or repairs or the belongings that were damaged and or stolen. Renter's insurance is also a good thing, even though it's not necessarily if there's damage to the property, because the property isn't yours. But if anything goes missing of your belongings, something gets stolen, etc., renter's insurance is good as well. Make sure you stick to your budget, right? You don't make it just for fun. You make it so that way you can be financially stable, pay for your utilities. You also want to save for emergencies. Now, obviously, when we take a look at making these housing options, life happens, right? We all went through that pandemic a few years ago, but we know that a lot of people got laid off. A lot of jobs couldn't have that many people in the building at once for safety reasons. Sometimes just the companies aren't doing well. There's less people visiting them, and they either have to have layoffs, right? And things happen. Typically speaking, at the very, very minimum, you want to make sure that you have 2 months rent or 2 months in mortgage payments. I know this also applies for living in houses. Minimum as a backup, right? Because if something were to happen and you didn't have that money backup, what are you going to do, right? At least if you have a minimum of 2 months as a backup, that gives you a little bit of a safety net where if you get laid off because the company's not doing well, that you could look for an alternate job, right? It gives you that kind of comfort that you might need. Okay, we're going to go through a couple of examples. This first one here is about Allison. Allison is going on a student exchange to Spain for a semester, trying to decide on living arrangements. She plans on spending 20 weeks in Spain and has the following options. She could rent a room in a hostel for 25 bucks Canadian a night, which includes all utilities. Or option B is she can lease a one-bedroom apartment in the same neighborhood for $650 Canadian per month, plus a refundable damage deposit for $1,000. She's also charged 155 Canadian dollars per month for utilities. Which option should she choose and why? So we're going to take a look at both options and see how much she would charge or how much she should cost to kind of help make decisions. So option A, she's renting a hostel for 25 Canadian a night, which includes utilities. We know she's going for roughly 20 weeks. Now, there's not a perfect week to month conversion or vice versa, but we are going to do actually, no, there is a decent week to month conversion. We could do it in one step. We could do it in two step. But here, this is what we're going to do. So 20 weeks. I want weeks to go away. And I want to convert to months. Now, when I take a look, I don't know exactly how many weeks are in a month, right? There's not exactly 4. There are in February. But in like March, there's 31 days. So I can't say it's exactly 4. So I can't go 1 month is equal to so many weeks. But I do know that there's 52 weeks in a year. And there's 12 months in a year. So those two lengths must be equal. And I can do that conversion. So 20 times 12 divided by 52. That's approximately 4.62 months. Okay. The reason why I'm saying that is really for the later on version, but we're talking about she's spending 20 weeks, and later on we're talking about costs per month. So I do just want to point that out. Okay, back to option A. We're good. Option A doesn't actually require any conversions, so we're just going to look at the cost. Now the cost is simply $25 a night. There are 7 nights in a week, and there's 20 weeks that she's staying there for. Simple, straightforward, 25 times 7 times 20. That will cost her $3,500. Okay? When we take a look at option 2, or option B, I should say, there's a little bit more associated with costs, right? We have the rent, we have a damage deposit, and we have the utilities cost that we want to take a look at. As we go through things, something that's important to notice that if you're being charged for rent, you can't really choose to rent for like a random amount of days when you're renting an apartment. You can't be like, oh, I want it for 7 days. It's not really how things work. So when we take a look, we know that 20 weeks is 4.62 months-ish. She would actually have to rent for 5 months instead of 4.62. You can't just choose random decimals. So when I take a look at my cost, I know that rent is $650, and I'm going to multiply that by 5 because $650 per month for 5 months. Utilities, I'm going to add in. So $155 for 5 months. Now, that damage deposit, we don't necessarily have to add in, but something that we might want to talk about as someone going somewhere and planning to stay in like an apartment, you don't really ever plan to damage things. Right? Like, I'm sure Allison's not going to Spain and being like, I'm going to ruin the place I'm living in. Ha-ha! Take that, Spain. Probably not. So let's assume that Allison is a great tenant. She's able to stay there, and she's not going to be getting charged that $1,000 damage deposit because it is refundable. So I'm not going to include that in the cost. However, when I'm making my decision, I can totally bring it up and be like, hey, if Allison does damage stuff, she's going to have to pay that extra $1,000, and that's going to be rough, right? So we can talk about it, but I'm not going to add it in for that reason. I could plug that in. So I find out that rent alone is going to total $3,250. Utilities are going to be $775, and in total, it's going to be $4,025. Now, when we take a look, it says which option should you choose and why. It doesn't actually matter what option you choose as long as you justify it properly. So let's say she chose option A. So choose option A. There's a lot of reasons that we could indicate that she should choose that. We can say it's just less overall cost, right? I see the two costs. That's great. She doesn't also have to pay that $1,000 up front. There's no upfront large payment. I'd also say that she can be pretty flexible on how long she stays. So flexible to stay, let's say less time. Right? She could stay more time as well. There's flexibility there, but it's not really an advantage because you could also choose to stay more time in option B. But in option A, say she's like, oh, I'm really hating it after, 19 weeks, and that one last week she just doesn't want to do. She's so homesick. She wants to go home. Well, then she doesn't have to pay for those remaining 7 days, right? Because she's on a per day basis. So staying for 1 extra day or staying 8 fewer days, there's some flexibility there, okay? There's also potential reasons why she might choose to option B. Personally, option B sounds pretty good because you have the space to yourself. You have privacy and space to yourself, right? Like, if you're somewhere where you've never been before, it might be good to stay with others, right? A hostel can be pretty busy, but it also sometimes nice to have that alone time, especially if you're not there just to like travel and have fun and like live it up in Spain. She's there for a student exchange program, so she still seems like she probably has a job to get done, whether that's schoolwork or whatever. Having that space to yourself might be worthwhile. It's also safer or more secure, right? Some hostels have it so that you're sharing a room with other people. Other people might not be staying for 20 weeks. You don't know who you're bunking with or if you're in a big communal bed area. That's something to kind of consider. But also, like, if you're not with everyone else, like, less risk of, diseases spreading. So, like, what if someone comes in and they had bed bugs and now there's bed bugs in your place, right? Something to just kind of consider. Lastly, another big advantage of option B is you've already paid that last half month, right? You're staying for 4.62 months, but you've already paid for that last 0.38 of a month. So you can stay that remaining end of the month at no additional cost. So if she wants to stay for an extra week or two, you do you, Allison. No extra charges here. So she can stay the rest of the 5th month for no extra charge. All right, now there's other options, or there's other benefits to each of them, or maybe why you would choose A or choose B. When I ask you a question of what do you choose and why, please note that I'm only anticipating that you say choose option A, less overall cost. You do not have to say anything else. Or you can see choose option A, no upfront large payment. And I don't have to say anything else. Or choose option B because she could stay the rest of the 5th month for no extra charge. And that's it. You do not have to weigh both options every single time. Just trying to remind you that both options are valid and both you can choose to follow, and that's great. All right, Marie and Marty. Marie and Marty have just moved to Brandon and are considering two of the following house options. The first one, they can buy the house, a house for purchase. The purchase price is $249,000. There's a down payment of $50,000 that would be required. And they'd have a 25-year mortgage and an interest rate of 3%, compounded semi-annually. Option 2 is to rent an apartment. There's monthly payments of $1,300. There's monthly parking fees of $60. All right. What would Marie and Marty's monthly mortgage payment be for option 1, show your work? Okay, pause the video, get her done. Then unpause it once you're ready. Okay, welcome back. So we know that I see a down payment there. Down payments will never belong in my TVM, so I need to use that down payment to figure out the loan amount. So $249,000 minus that $50,000 is equal to $199,000. Now I know that I'm going to use my TVM. And I know some information straight from the question. And I know that I'm looking for the size of their monthly payment, which is going to be that question mark. Things that I know. Interest rate, 3%, compounded semi-annually. I know the loan amount is $199,000. They want that loan to be paid off, so it's 0. They're making, monthly mortgage payments, so PY is 12. It doesn't say at the beginning, so it's implied that it's at the end. N is 12 times 25, which is 300. All right, my payment should come out negative, but remember we don't include negatives in the final answer. And this is my final answer, so 2 decimals is necessary. So $941.76 would be their monthly mortgage payment. Just backtracking really quick, when we were talking about advantages about leasing, I said sometimes the monthly payments are smaller. This is not the case in this example, right? Buying the house actually has a lower monthly mortgage payment than the monthly payment there. However, maybe it's worth it because maybe every single utility is included and maybe $1,300 a month plus the $60 a month, okay, does happen to be cheaper than all of those costs added together on their own. Who knows? Okay. What is the total amount paid for each option? Now remember that for option 1 here, the housing for purchase option, it's not saying total amount paid on the loan. It's saying total amount paid for that house. So when I'm taking a look at option 1, I need to make sure that the total amount of paid includes the down payment. So the amount they're paying is $941.76. They're doing that a total of 300 times because N represents the total number of payments. And, take that back. It didn't say total amount of payments or amount paid total, but specifically over 10 years. Whew, that was close. So, I'm actually not multiplying it by 300 because that would be over the span of 25 years because that's 12 times 25. So I'm going to multiply it by 12 times 10. $941.76 every month, so 12 times a year for 10 years, so times 10. Now, at the beginning of that first moment, that first day that they've got the house, they also paid that $50,000. So that's something that they've already paid within the first 10 years. And now we're just adding. So all of the costs of the payments total to, $113,011.20 plus, of course, the $50,000, which gives me $163,011.20. Option 2. Now, option 2, we can do those costs separately. We could do those costs together. They're all both over the same kind of frequency. They're both monthly payments, right? The monthly payment of $1,300, the monthly payment of $60. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do it together this time. Okay? So I'm going to say each month they pay $1,300 plus 60, right? So to really $1,360. They're doing that 12 times a year because it's monthly for 10 total years. And when I figure that out, I get $163,200. Now, hopefully you take a look at this and you go, wow, there are some real advantages monetarily for choosing to purchase the house, right? Because after 10 years, they're pretty much paying the same amount. Like at the end of the day, $190 isn't make it or break it over the span of 10 years, okay? But option one allows them to own that home. They have equity in that home after 10 years, whereas option two, they don't have equity in their home. So like pretty big advantages. But the question doesn't care about what we think in this case. It doesn't matter if we would choose option one or option two. We have to simply state an advantage of renting the apartment. So we can't say it's cheaper because we can see that it's not. But one of the major advantages is that there's not a large down payment up front. There is no large down payment up front. Right? $50,000 is kind of insane, right? To have that amount of money just ready to go. Maybe Marie and Marty have it and then good for them. But if they didn't, that really puts the apartment option at a really big advantage. So it's not always about the end of the day what the costs are, because if it was, more people would just straight up buy houses. But clearly some advantages are better for other people, and that's something we just have to keep in mind. All right, that's it. There's some practice that follows. Please tackle that. Otherwise, I will see you when I see you. Have a lovely day. Bye.